Tonight, I am more than excited to introduce our speaker. As I'm looking for speakers for topics and things, I do a lot of research. And I scroll through videos and I look at different places that have had different presentations. And I came across his presentation on this topic from another military site. And it was wonderful and it was so enlightening. And I thought, he's just someone that we need to have here. And David is a historian of American foreign relations and a professor of history at Rutgers University. Most of his research is focused on the American-Soviet and American-Russian relations. He's the author of 3 books. His second book is called American Mission and the Evil Empire, and it was published in 2007. He has another book that's coming out in the fall, probably in September, and it's called Distant Friends and Intimate Enemies. It was co-authored with 2 Russian historians. I can't wait to read that one, because when you look at how American history has changed over the course of the years and how World War II has impacted it so greatly. So without further ado, I will introduce you to tonight's speaker, David Foglesong. Thank you.
Thank you to Peggy for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this series. I'm also happy to visit Wolfeboro for the first time, arriving yesterday and this morning, getting a chance to walk around. Lovely community here. When I teach at Rutgers about the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, Truman, Stalin, the American press, I usually give 3 or 4 separate lectures on the topic. So I'm going to be compressing, and I obviously will not be able to be comprehensive tonight. So instead of covering the topic, what I plan to do is to, well, as you can see from the skeletal outline, I plan to first show you how there is a transformation of American-Soviet relations between 1945 and 1947 with images. And as I go through the images, I would like to encourage your questions, your comments about the propaganda posters, political cartoons that I'm showing, which I think will open up, instead of covering a topic, open up new perspectives on the topic. I also will try to challenge some common explanations or some common assumptions, for example, about Truman and Stalin, and then not covering the topic comprehensively, but just looking at some specific dimensions. I'll talk about Soviet repression in Eastern Europe, the role of the US press, and then what we call atomic diplomacy. So those would be the topics I'll select for discussion. Let's start with the meeting at the Elbe River. What's the date? April 25th, 1945. And this is a Soviet propaganda poster showing, obviously, the Soviet troops coming in from the east, the American and British troops coming from the west. And the lettering at the bottom, glory to the Red Army and to our allies coming from the West, who are meeting in the center of fascist Germany. Let's take a moment to think about this time, late April 1945. So I think this is a good starting point for the lecture tonight, because this is just less than 2 weeks after Harry Truman, after FDR's death, after Truman becomes president. What else should we think about from that moment, late April 1945? What else is happening that's really striking? I think with this museum dedicated to World War II and with an emphasis on the experience of veterans, one of the things I think to keep in mind is the way that for Americans who were present at that time, this is a really profound experience. First of all, grateful to meet the Soviets and not be fighting Germans anymore, but to meet the Soviets and have the feeling that the war is really ending. For them, this is a really profound experience, and for some of them, it's a life-shaping experience. For example, a man named Joe Pulowski, who was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants to Chicago, was one of the US soldiers who was there at the meeting at the Elbe River. And for him, it's such a profound experience that every April 25th after that, and he lived on into the 1980s and 1990s, every April 25th after that in Chicago, he would go to a particular bridge in Chicago and commemorate with a placard or poster. For him is the profound importance, and he thought of it as showing the possibility of US-Soviet friendship and of the necessity of avoiding a new war. So that's one dimension. What else should we have in mind from late April of 1945? What else is going on? Yeah.
Roosevelt died.
Roosevelt had died on April 12th, and so this is one of the things I'll talk about is the early stage of Truman's presidency. So yes, that's very important. But what else is happening?
Preparation for D-Day.
D-Day has happened June of 1944.
Right.
Preparation for that.
Yeah, so this is after. So this is April of 1945. So this is almost a year later. But I think that's important because for the Soviets, there had been a long delay of where they had hoped that the British and the Americans would get involved on the Western Front. And finally, June 1944, they do get involved. They fulfill the promise, and that kind of sets a stage for the Soviet propaganda here, not to be saying, we only won the war, but to celebrate the alliance with the Western powers that has brought about the victory. What else is happening?
The war is still going on.
The war is still going on, has a few more days left till the defeat in Berlin. Yes, still fighting in Hungary and mopping up in Czechoslovakia. But what also I think is really important as a starting point for this discussion is the German concentration camps are still being liberated. And so the full horror of the Holocaust is now really being communicated. And this has a profound impact, I think, that many people don't realize. Maybe many of you do because of your age and your life experience, but many younger people don't realize that this is a moment when many Americans regard the Soviets as the Allies and Nazi Germany as the terrible villains whose the full array of their atrocities is only now really being fully revealed in the spring of 1945. And that leads many Americans at this moment in time, spring of 1945, to be very sympathetic with the idea of a harsh treatment of Germany after the war, which then lines up with the Soviet orientation to a harsh, vindictive, punitive treatment of Nazi Germany. That sets the stage for something that I'm going to come back to in a moment. At this moment in time, in April of 1945, public opinion surveys ask, what do you think about the future? Can the Soviets be trusted? They didn't say Soviets, they said Russians. Can the Russians be trusted to cooperate with us in the post-war world? Most Americans at this point in time said yes. At this point in time, we still very much want the Soviets to get in the war in the Far East, which they do roughly 3 months later at the beginning of August of 1945. When Americans are asked that question about cooperation in the post-war world, more Americans were concerned at that point about cooperation with the British in the post-war world. They thought it was more likely there were going to be problems with the British Empire and with the exclusive British system than with the Soviets in the post-war world. So this is, I think, a good starting point for a lecture about the shift in US-Soviet relations between 1945 and 1947. So I have a few slides here where I try to illustrate graphically the difference between the feeling at the meeting at the Elbe River, end of April 1945, and the Western Allies are shaking hands with the Russians, and the expectation, the strong expectation, even among many conservative, anti-communist Americans at that point in time, is that that handshake sets the stage for post-war cooperation, because the priority is we don't want another world war after this. We have to find a way to cooperate, and it seems, since they've done their part of defeating Nazi Germany and we've come in from the West, it seems there's optimism, as you can see, about the post-war world at that moment. 3 years later, with the time of the Berlin blockade, I think you can see from the pairing of the imagery that this is a dramatic transformation in American-Soviet relations. Or take this pair of images. Time magazine, the big three. So just like the Soviets celebrating the victorious conclusion of the Grand Alliance in Europe. Now, what's remarkable about this? Who was the publisher of Time magazine? Henry Luce, and what was his political orientation? Conservative, Republican, anti-communist, and yet even Henry Luce's publications in the spring of 1945 are celebrating the victorious Grand Alliance. In other words, setting aside the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union and being optimistic about the future. And yet, just 2 years later, we have the William Randolph Hearst publication in the New York Journal American saying, hold on a minute, we're not allies, they're enemies. We're not birds of a feather. There's the American eagle and there is the Soviet vulture. So this is another way of trying to dramatically illustrate to you the radical shift in relations in a short period of time. Well, what about the Soviet propaganda? In 1945, if you go into Soviet magazines and you go into propaganda posters that are displayed to Soviet citizens, they repeatedly celebrate the Grand Alliance, the American flag, the Soviet flag, the British flag. And here, Hitler is being destroyed by the successful Grand Alliance. What's the transition? Can you hear me all right? Okay. What's the transition? There's Uncle Sam in the background. Uncle Sam in gold. He's not the main enemy, though. Who is the main enemy? In red, in the red jacket here. Who do you suppose that would be? Churchill, John Bull, the representation of Britain. And why is he now the enemy? Because he's allowing the fascist fish to go back and swim in the lake again. So what is this a reference to? Before, in the Soviet eyes, we're celebrating the Grand Alliance, which brought about the defeat of Nazi Germany, and we thought we had a commitment to the thorough denazification of Germany. But now, in 1947, the British and the Americans are backing away from the aggressive denazification of Germany and thinking that we need to focus on the economic reconstruction of the western zones of Germany. So from that standpoint, for the Soviets, this is really a betrayal. This is number one priority to them, is we do not want Germany to be able to attack the Soviet Union again. And yet the British and the Americans are starting to think about economic reconstruction, limiting the reparations from the Western zones to the Soviet Union, which is number one priority for Stalin and the Soviet Union. Economic reconstruction of so much that had been destroyed by German armies over the course of the war. So, dramatic difference between 45 and 47. Or even take it in this way. 1943. January 1943. So those of you who know your military history, what's the context? What's just happened? January 1943. No, that comes a little bit later. January 1943, Stalingrad, exactly. And the caption at the bottom, Man of the Year. All that Hitler could give, he took for a second time. In other words, Time magazine, under Henry Luce's overall editorial direction, is giving personal credit for the defeat of the German armies at Stalingrad to Joseph Stalin's strong leadership of the Soviet Union. So Stalin is Man of the Year as a hero. When Stalin dies in March of 1953, of course, he is the ultimate of the villain, and the spider web that surrounds him shows all of his victims. So another way of dramatizing the enormous differences between mid-1940s and early 1950s. Okay, so that's the first thing that I've tried to do is to just demonstrate in talking about 45 to 47 or 48, we're talking about a period of dramatic changes. Now I want to challenge some common conceptions about the main figures in U.S.-Soviet relations in this period. First Truman, and then I'll talk a bit about Stalin. Truman, I think many people assume, was a decisive Cold Warrior bent on confrontation with the Soviet Union from the very start of his presidency. And one reason people think this is that Truman said, when he first met the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov on April 23rd, 1945, he said, "How did I do? I gave him a 1-2 to the jaw and told him, if you don't like being lectured like this, live up to your agreements." That's part, I think, of the standard sort of assumption about Harry Truman is he's the guy who has the buck stops here on his desk. He's a decisive leader. He's tough right from the outset. Actually, I think Truman is insecure. He has not been fully informed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt about the nature of Roosevelt's discussions with Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943 and at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. So when Truman says, "How did I do?" that's a reflection of his insecurity about his performance in his first meeting with Molotov. And so he quickly shifts from confrontation to, in May 1945, he sends Harry Hopkins, FDR's troubleshooter, off to Moscow to negotiate with Stalin to resolve the issue. So not just confrontation, but let's fix the disagreement about the composition of the Polish government. So to me, that really shows the indecisive or vacillating nature of Harry Truman's approach to U.S.-Soviet relations from the outset, where he says, I want to carry on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with the Soviet Union. I just want to alter the terms so that we get 85% of what we want in any negotiation. Yes?
Do you think his insecurities and his black and white look view of the world was significantly affected by the fact that he never went to college?
I think it's more affected that he's not been part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inner circle. He hasn't been fully informed. Roosevelt really should have known that his days were numbered, but he didn't really bring Harry Truman in to participate, to understand what had been going on. And Truman didn't have much experience in the foreign policy sphere. He'd been supervising some defense and military issues in the Senate, but really had not had much diplomatic experience. I think that's more of the answer of
Why
Truman's.
was a competent socialist like Henry Wallace replaced by someone like him who was so limited?
Well,
He was
Wallace.
going to die.
Yeah, Wallace was unpopular among many in the middle and on the right of the Democratic Party. And those were power brokers within the Democratic Party. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not stand up and say, I want Henry Wallace to continue to be my vice president. That's a really important story, which could be the subject of an entire separate lecture about Henry Wallace. And the one thing, I do appreciate your question, because the one thing that's really important to emphasize about that is Wallace is one of the figures who continues to emphasize the Soviet role in the victory during World War II. Whereas many other people start to think, we won the war. We won the war. After all, we used the atomic bomb against the Japanese. We defeated the Japanese. And by August 1945, that's the main story in people's minds. And you start to forget about what happened between 1941 and May of 1945 in Europe. And so when Harry Truman says we expect to get 85% of what we want in a negotiation, part of the background of that is a feeling like we really won the war. Whereas from the Soviet perspective, they lost more than 25 million people during the war. And From their perspective, they did 80% of the work of defeating Nazi Germany, so they expected to get a lion's share of what they wanted at any negotiation. So your question leads right into a fundamental underlying problem in US-Soviet relations in the post-war period. Let me just finish this point about Truman not being such a decisive, single-minded, consistently tough figure. At the Potsdam Conference, late July, early August 1945, Truman is informed of the successful test of an atomic bomb in New Mexico. And we know from the diplomatic records that Truman is pepped up by that and is more prepared to be tough and confrontational and insist on getting the US way. And that means, in part, backing away from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's promise that the United States would favorably consider $10 billion worth of reparations from Germany to the Soviet Union after the war. So Truman and Burns back away from that. And part of the backing away from that is pepped up by feeling we have the power to determine the nature of the post-war world, and the Soviets have just got to lump it and go along with what we want. But he doesn't stay simply with that tough confrontational line. At the end of 1945, he sends Secretary of State Jimmy Burns off to Moscow to do deals again. This time over the composition of the governments in Romania and Bulgaria. So my point is that Truman is not so consistent, is vacillating. And what I'll come back to in a later point is that opens the door for him to be pushed in a particular direction by American domestic political considerations. What about Stalin? I think many Americans, including President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, believe that Stalin, at the end of World War II, was determined to spread communism everywhere around the world. We know now from the diplomatic records that have been opened up that that's not the case. Stalin's first priority, 1945 to 1947, was preserving good relations with the United States and the United Kingdom. Not because he loved the United States or loved capitalism, but because he saw it as in Soviet interests. And the number one Soviet interest was in the economic reconstruction of the country. All the way into the summer of 1945, Stalin was still hoping for massive economic assistance from the United States, in particular for the economic reconstruction. He actually sent Molotov to Paris for the discussions about the Marshall Plan in June of 1947, thinking that the Soviet Union might participate in the Marshall Plan. So it's only after he realizes that the Marshall Plan has been designed in such a way that it's going to make it difficult for the Soviet Union to participate, because it will have to disclose information about its economy, and it will have to participate under the terms of the conditions for the reconstruction assistance, and it's designed to lure the East Europeans away from the Soviet bloc. It's only after that Stalin really gives up on the idea of massive economic assistance, including, they thought maybe, at one time they're talking about a $6 billion post-war loan from the United States, then they go down to $1 billion. They're still hoping for that. So in that context, Stalin did not want to do something that was going to alienate or antagonize the United States or the United Kingdom. So when it came to France and Italy, where there were large, we were talking about Italy before, there were large, authentically popular communist parties. Why? Well, one reason was that they had been the backbone of the resistance to fascism inside those countries. There were hotheads, not only among the communists in Italy, but also among some socialist radicals in Italy. And they wanted to seize power. And Stalin told them no. So far from seeking to prioritize armed revolution to spread communism around the world, Stalin discouraged armed seizures of power by communists in Italy and France, telling them, you're popular enough that you can come to power through the ballot box within the democratic system, Same point could be made with regard to China, where on into 1948, Stalin actually is discouraging the Chinese communists from trying to be victorious against the nationalists. So there's a sort of mythology. I'm glad we had a chance to talk about Italy, because here's some images with regard to Italy. So there's an election in Italy in April 1948. And Americans are very worried that the communists are so popular that they might win that election. That's the real problem. But how is it presented to the American public in political cartoons? The suggestion here is that this is going to be external aggression from the Soviet Union. The real problem is that the communists are likely to win more than 30%, maybe in the multi-party election, 35% of the vote. Maybe as a result of that, the communists will come to power through the ballot box. We don't want that. So Italian Americans are encouraged to write to Italians and tell them, don't vote for the communists. But so my point here is this is a misleading idea about Stalin and Soviet policy in the post-war world. If you want to read more about that, I highly recommend a book by Alessandro Brogi, which shows, based on archives in the French and Italian Communist Party archives and in the Soviet Communist Party archives, that that is not the case of the nature of Soviet policy. But you can see that that's how it's represented at the time, that the octopus is going to come from outside of Italy. This is also fundamentally important because this is one of the earliest political cartoons to use the word Cold War, to use the term Cold War. And what does it suggest? Stalin and the Soviet Union are controlling, manipulating communists in Italy and France like they are puppets. Actually, what Stalin is doing is trying to restrain them from seizing power. So there's a kind of, my point is, there's a kind of myth about a determined Soviet desire to spread communism everywhere around the world. And that includes Greece, which, as you know from Truman's so-called Truman Doctrine speech from March of 1947, that's at the center of what people think of as the start of the Cold War. And Truman is talking there about the danger of communists coming to power in Greece. Well, what has Stalin's policy been with regard to the Greek communists? Stalin had done a deal with Winston Churchill in October of 1944, the so-called percentages deal, where Churchill had written on a slip of paper. You familiar with this? Churchill had written on a slip of paper, how about it? We get 90% in Greece and you get 10%. And in Romania, you get 90% and we get 10%. And in Yugoslavia, we'll split that 75-25. And in Hungary, we'll split that 50-50, okay? How about it? And Stalin puts a big check mark on the slip of paper, and he agrees with Churchill. And fundamentally, that means that Churchill's saying, you can be the predominant influence in Romania and Bulgaria, and you accept that Greece is going to be our sphere of influence. Stalin abided by that. When the British forces massacred Greeks in the streets in Athens, the Soviets did nothing. Stalin did not send direct military assistance to the Greek communists. Tito and Yugoslavians did, that's true, but not from Stalin. And Stalin, furthermore, did not allow Greek communists to join his Communist Information Bureau that he created after the Marshall Plan. Okay, so my point there has been conceptions about Stalin as being determined to spread communism all the way around the world. That's the start of the Cold War. That's false. There's another myth about the origin of Cold War that I think is not well known. The first use of the term Cold War in the United States is actually by the financier and political advisor Bernard Baruch. April 16th, 1947. Now what does he say? Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War. This is the first use of the phrase inside the United States. Harry Truman didn't really like that phrase after he heard it. Didn't use it very much. It's Baruch that introduces this phrase. And what does that mean? Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Our unrest is the heart of their success. So what is he saying? The Soviets and the communists inside the United States are trying to stir up trouble. They're trying to create a revolutionary situation inside the United States. That's at the heart of his introduction of the concept of Cold War. Is that true? Stalin has no interest and no real belief in the possibility of a revolution inside the United States. And the Communist Party of the United States was oriented towards working within the American political system. This gentleman over here mentioned Henry Wallace. The Communist Party of the United States is oriented towards backing Henry Wallace's Progressive Party in the 1940 election. They're determined to work within the American political system. They're not seeking the overthrow of the American government. So what is Baruch actually concerned about? He's concerned about the power of American labor unions. He's concerned about the wave of strikes that have taken place after the end of the war, with labor unions concerned about their high cost of living, wanting dramatic increases in their wages. And Baruch wants everybody to be back to work, working hard, no strikes, no lockouts by the employers. Let's have full production. That's what Baruch is talking about. So he brings in the idea of a Cold War and of the Soviet Union trying to stir up a revolution inside the United States to sell his program here, which is we want to curb the power of militant labor unions. This is one day before Congress passes the first round of the Taft-Hartley legislation to try to curb the power of militant labor unions, and particularly of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. So my point is that what is really going on here is that there is a domestic problem that Baruch is concerned about, but he's putting it in terms of a Cold War. So if the common stories about Truman and Stalin are incorrect, what should we emphasize to look at the shift from 1945 alliance to 1947, 1948 enmity? First thing I would emphasize is Soviet repression in Eastern Europe. At the Tehran Conference in Iran in November, December 1945, and then again at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had assured Stalin he understood the Soviet Union's need for friendly governments on its borders in Eastern Europe. We understand that you've been invaded through there. In fact, some forces, for example, from Hungary, have attacked into the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe. We understand that you need friendly governments in Eastern Europe. Franklin Delano Roosevelt tells his ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, he doesn't give a damn about Eastern Europe. The only thing he cares about with regard to Eastern Europe is it should not be the cause of a third world war. So think about FDR's mentality. World War I started Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, Bosnia. World War II started Eastern Europe. So Franklin Roosevelt's mentality is, I don't want a third world war to start in Eastern Europe. So he's prepared to say, okay, Soviets, you have a sphere of influence there. Roosevelt talked about his conception of the post-war world as the four policemen. The British, the United States, the Soviets, and he thought at that time, nationalist China would be the four policemen. And each would be responsible for policing its particular area. So you can understand, based on that, why Stalin thought, okay, I did a percentages agreement deal with Churchill in October 1945. Roosevelt is telling me he understands my need for friends. You can understand why Stalin thought, I can have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and have good relations with the United States and the United Kingdom in the post-war world. Unfortunately, Stalin pursues that sphere of influence in a particularly bloody and repressive way, starting in Poland and Romania, which are, as you can see, geopolitically more important for the Soviet Union, and then in 1947 and 1948, cracking down in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia with the Prague coup in February of 1948. And the impact of that is that it alienates and antagonizes and creates suspicion among Americans who had earlier been sympathetic to the Soviet Union. They now see a brutal, bloody, heavy-handed, repressive policy. Roosevelt had thought, okay, you got your sphere of influence, but do it in a nice, gentle kind of way. And Stalin does it in a really brutal and antagonizing and bloody way. So that would be one factor that I would emphasize in the shift, particularly in public attitudes between 1945 and 47 or 48. What else would I emphasize? Second, I would emphasize domestic politics and public opinion in the United States. Let's take this image. The Atlanta Constitution was under the editorship of a guy named Ralph McGill, a liberal Democrat, a pro-FDR Democrat who believed in the possibility of post-war cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in this political cartoon, the Atlanta Constitution that he edited is expressing concern that there are some people in the United States who are trying to stir up trouble, trying to fan a spark into a conflagration, trying to take little irritations and problems in U.S.-Soviet relations and make a big issue out of them. Who are those people? Who are the people who are engaged in a hate Russia campaign in the eyes of the Atlanta Constitution? Well,
Fascists.
okay, Henry Wallace would call them fascists. Ralph McGill would say they are reactionaries. They are people like William Randolph Hearst. They are people like Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. Vehement anti-communists who have kept their mouths shut between June 1941 and May 1945 because they understand that to harshly criticize the Soviet Union from an anti-communist standpoint would mean you sound like Hitler, you sound like Goebbels. So they kept their mouths shut about that. Once Germany is defeated in May 1945, they start to go back to their vehement criticism of communism and the Soviet Union. That's what the Atlanta Constitution is referring to here when it says a hate Russia campaign. What's so important about that? In that campaign, Hearst and McCormick and others tried to flip American public images of the Soviet Union. Before, the Soviet Union was our ally and Nazi Germany was our enemy. A nice way to flip that story is to talk about red fascism and to say that Stalin is just like Hitler. They are twin totalitarianisms. And this is a means of trying to turn, don't think of the Soviet Union as our wartime ally, think of the Soviet Union as our eternal ideological enemy who has a plan for world conquest just like Hitler did. That's a story that they begin to tell already in the summer of 1945. Even at August 6th, of course, is Hiroshima. So the defeat of Japan is not yet a done deal. And even then, the anti-communist, anti-Soviet campaign is well underway in the United States. Why is that important? Because if Harry Truman is vacillating and insecure and unsure and wants to hold together a Democratic Party that includes people like Henry Wallace, who are still pro-Soviet in orientation, and includes people like Joseph E. Davies, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union. If Wallace is concerned about that, then he can be pushed by domestic political considerations to alter his course. And how do we see that? Well, let's take a look at this image from the Chicago Tribune, Robert McCormick's paper, one of the most widely read newspapers in the United States in the late 1940s. So here's Harry Truman, presumably in the Oval Office. And he's being accused of appeasement of Russia. Appeasement of Russia. So that term means going back to the British policy of the 1930s. And so the comparison here is to Neville Chamberlain. So we see Chamberlain's umbrella here. The accusation is in being too soft on the Soviet Union in your first months in office, you are really being like the appeaser Neville Chamberlain. So this is a different way of using that analogy. The lesson of Munich. You don't appease a dictator. That just emboldens their worldwide aggression. So I would argue that this is an important factor pushing Truman towards a harder line. Why? He's anticipating 1946, there's going to be a midterm congressional election, and he's worried that this kind of perception of him creates a vulnerability from the right. And in fact, the Republicans will do well in the 1946 midterm election, which is something that Harry Truman is concerned about. So by January of 1946, Harry Truman is saying, privately, I'm sick of babying the Soviets. We have to take a tougher line with regard to them. So I would suggest domestic politics and public opinion is a part of that. What else should we think about to explain the shift 1945 to 1947, 1948? Well, what does this image tell you?
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of a big stick. An atomic bomb. So that's bigger than Teddy Roosevelt would have imagined as a big stick. So he's got the olive branch in front, but behind his back he's got the atomic bomb. So what is the Soviet propaganda suggesting? Harry Truman is practicing atomic diplomacy. That is, attempting to extract diplomatic advantage from the American, well, by 1950, no longer monopoly, because the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in August of 1949, but the American preponderance of an atomic arsenal. So the Soviet perception is the Americans are using that to try to intimidate us. They talking about negotiation in public, but really behind the scenes they're trying to intimidate us with their military power. Were the Soviets right to suspect that this was the American objective? Well, if we go back into the records, I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, right? You know a little bit about General Leslie Groves, whose main purpose, as he saw the atomic bomb project, was to subdue the Russians. Harry Truman and Secretary of State Jimmy Burns didn't use the word subdue. They used the term make the Russians more manageable in the post-war world. So the expectation, even during the war, is the atomic bomb, just by possessing it, not because we're going to threaten them. Stalin, if you don't cut this out, we're going to let you have. They don't really go that far. Burns jokes about that with Molotov. In September 1945, he says, I've got an atomic bomb in my hip pocket. If you don't cut all this stalling at the negotiating table, I'm going to pull it out and let you have it. That's a joke, but that's a reflection of an implicit assumption that they should be more manageable. If you saw the film Oppenheimer, you know, I think, that Truman believed the Russians are backward technologically. They will never have an atomic bomb. Well, if you have that expectation, then you have the idea that our monopoly of the atomic bomb is going to last for a substantial period of time. They didn't anticipate in 1945 that within 4 years, the Soviets would acquire an atomic bomb capability. What's Stalin's response to that? The Americans are trying to intimidate us. The Americans are trying to blackmail us. I see that already at the Potsdam Conference by the way that Truman's body language becomes more aggressive. So he goes back after the meeting with Truman and he says to his military men and to his scientists, speed up the work on the atomic bomb project. Instead of becoming more manageable, Stalin becomes more stubborn. He tells Molotov, don't make any concessions at the negotiating table because that would just embolden the Americans to demand more. So Truman's expectation is it'll make them more manageable. Actually, it makes them more stubborn and more resistant to concessions at the negotiating table. Public perception inside the United States. We've got it. We're going to keep it. It's ours. We built it. Never mind that the British participated pretty actively in the project. It's ours. We built it. We're going to keep it. Even British cartoonists have this perspective that the Americans are trying to order other countries around in the post-war world based on their monopoly of the atomic bomb. We can more or less dictate terms, as Truman put it, get 85% of what we want based on our preponderance of power. Here's one of the nicest illustrations, I think, of a Soviet mentality. This is from 1948. In the bottom, who's this figure? Uncle Sam, right. Only not the usual American representation of Uncle Sam, right? This is an old guy, a really old guy, decrepit old capitalist with his top hat, the stereotype, and he's got an atomic bomb in one hand, and he's got a torch for inciting insurrection in the other. What else is interesting about this story? The Red Army soldier leans out of the window of the USSR and says, "Nie balуй," which is, don't mess around, don't even think about it, I'm going to give it to you. And what is that book that he has in his hand?
The Great Patriotic War.
Exactly. The history of the Great Patriotic War. So Stalin's mentality is, look, we did most of the work of defeating Nazi Germany. We know how to fight. You don't have enough atomic bombs yet to make a really big difference in the nature of warfare. We're not going to be intimidated. So don't even try it. So this is, I think, an important dimension of the deterioration of relations 1945 to 1948. Why is this worth mentioning in relation to contemporary politics? Putin has said, this is one quotation, but I think he said this more than once, his interpretation of why the United States used the atomic weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only one goal, to intimidate our country and the rest of the world. Now, of course, that's a terrible oversimplification, and in a future lecture in this series, Dr. Gordon is going to address in great detail all the factors behind the decision-making, which really, I think, emphasize more winning the war against Japan quickly as the #1 motive for going ahead with the use of the atomic weapons. Now, ending the war quickly against Japan did have an anti-Soviet component to it. Because winning the war quickly against Japan meant the Soviet forces would have less time because they invade Manchuria, massive invasion. They had their eye on occupying northern part of Japan. So ending the war quickly against Japan does have an implication of containing Soviet expansion in the Far East. But that's not the primary motivation for the use of the atomic weapon. Nonetheless, the important point here is, in the Soviet perspective, and Putin is sort of echoing the majority Soviet thinking at the time in 1945, that's what the Americans were trying to do, is to intimidate us. So what have I tried to suggest in this brief presentation, not comprehensive, just focusing on a few elements? First, neither Truman or Stalin wanted a drastic deterioration of relations. Truman said, I want to carry out Roosevelt's policy of cooperation, but just on different terms. Stalin wanted cooperation, not because he loved capitalism, but because he thought it was in Soviet interests to preserve a cooperative and particularly economic relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom. I've tried to show that most people in the United States in 1945, including those US soldiers who met the Soviet forces at the Elbe River in the eastern part of Germany in April 1945, they did not think that a drastic deterioration of relations to enmity was inevitable. They thought post-war cooperation was going to be possible. It is true that US and Soviet priority vital interests did diverge in some respects, and in particular over Germany, where the United States saw it as being in its interest to rapidly revive the German economy, and the Soviets thought, no, the priority with regard to Germany should be the extraction of reparations from Germany for the rebuilding of the Soviet Union. That should be the priority. So there is a divergence of interest, there certainly is. But did that necessarily have to lead to a severe Cold War and a shift from alliance to enmity, I think it didn't have to go that far. And I think one reason it did go that far is that there is distortion and misperception. And some of those misperceptions I've tried to mention. Baruch's distortion about the Soviets are bent on stirring up trouble inside the United States, trying to foment a communist insurrection inside the United States. That's a misperception. Soviets trying to spread communism everywhere around the world, 1945 to 1947. I think that's a massive misperception. The Soviet propagandists are wrong in that they suggest, as this image does, that the Americans are preparing for a new war against the Soviet Union. That's not the objective. William Randolph Hearst, even the most vehement anti-communists, with their hatred of the Soviet Union, their comparison to red fascism, they're not trying to prepare the ground for a new war against the Soviet Union. But that's the way the Soviet propaganda presents it. So in each of these respects, I think misperceptions are an important part of the story of the deterioration of relations.